Dr. McNamara is an expert in American political thought, the American founding, Alexander Hamilton, political economy, and early modern political thought generally. He is the author of Political Economy and Statesmanship, Smith, Hamilton, and the Founding of the Commercial Republic, and the editor of The Noblest Minds, Fame, Honor, and the American Founding, as well as, with Lewis Hunt of Michigan State University, Liberalism, Conservatism, and Hayek's Idea of Spontaneous Order. Professor McNamara has taught at Utah State University, Boston College, and Clemson University, where he was Hayek Visiting Scholar, and he is currently at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. And then last but not least, Dr. Thomas Merrill is an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. He is the author of Hume and the Politics of the Enlightenment on Cambridge Press, which won the Delbo Winthrop Prize for Best Recent Work in Political Philosophy. He's also the co-editor of The Political Thought of the Civil War, among other volumes. Dr. Merrill has held fellowships from Harvard, Princeton, and the American Enterprise Institute, and was a senior research analyst for the President's Council on Bioethics during the George W. Bush administration. He's associate director of the Political Theory Institute at American University, and he has also served as the coordinator of the undergraduate program of the Department of Government, as well as the chair of that fine department, where I also happen to teach.
It's an honor to be here with Professor Kors. Thank you to ACTA for the invitation. My title for this presentation is Adam Smith, Radical Scot. But before I get to Smith, I want to talk somewhat briefly, well, maybe not so briefly, about the idea of enlightenment itself. As Brad reminded us, there have been many enlightenments, or at least a few very important ones. I think first of the Socratic Enlightenment, which gave rise to political philosophy in the face of enormous hostility. There was also the medieval and Jewish Enlightenment, which confronted the challenge to science and reason by the biblical God, by the acknowledgement of a biblical God. On any set of terms, both these enlightenments would have to be described as radical enlightenments. This leads me to, I think, the more controversial thing I'll say today, and that is that the modern Enlightenment is, from its beginning until the present day, a radical movement. Much very interesting scholarship, indeed profound scholarship, has been devoted in recent decades to categorizing and expounding the different national approaches to the Enlightenment, and more importantly, for the purposes of this presentation, categorizing and delineating the different schools or strands of the modern Enlightenment. What has emerged is a division between what is described as a radical Enlightenment versus a moderate Enlightenment. This research has been extremely rich and extremely helpful, but I think it overlooks or obscures one very important thing. And that is that from the beginning, the Enlightenment is a radical project. Its goal is radical. That leads me to wonder whether it really makes sense or how important it is to describe a radical versus a moderate or pragmatic Enlightenment. What does it matter? Which means do you choose to get to that radical goal? Is it moderation? It could be moderation, could be stealth, could be revolution. What does it mean then to pursue a radical goal in a moderate way? Or is that even possible? Consider the scope of the modern Enlightenment. Unlike the Socratic Enlightenment and the medieval Enlightenment, the modern Enlightenment aims at changing society, really civilization as a whole. consider some of its key lines of attack or elements, a change in the nature of science, the understanding of science, a change in the understanding of the status of the individual, the role of government in our lives, the role of commerce, and accompanying it, the status of comfortable well-being as a goal for humanity, and lastly, the role of religion. Now, this list is something of a menu. You could have, you could place the emphasis on changing the status of the individual. You could place the emphasis on spreading commerce. But the goal is generally the same. Now, to drive home the point, let me give you sort of one example. Consider the First Amendment. And this is to point to the radicalness of the goal of the modern Enlightenment. Consider the First Amendment. It protects our freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, petition, and so on. Now, what would Socrates have said about the First Amendment? He was convicted of religious crimes and corrupting the young, but he drank the hemlock, and in his political discussions never comes close to recommending anything like a First Amendment. The goal of our Enlightenment is indeed radical. Now, conservatives these days are quite attached to the First Amendment for obvious reasons, pointed out by Michael Polyakov. But we should realize that that hasn't always been the case. Some of you might remember the great Walter Burns of Cornell and Toronto and the American Enterprise Institute. His first book was The First Amendment and the Future of American Democracy, which, among other things, pointed to the problems he saw in the First Amendment in supporting a democratic republic. So let me, with that by way of background, let me turn to Smith. Smith is usually seen as the embodiment of the moderate Enlightenment. He was the author of the stately theory of moral sentiments. In his politics, he was a skeptical Whig who rejected state of nature theorizing by the likes of Locke and Rousseau. On top of these foundational opinions of Smith, there were also Smith's sometimes infuriating caveats, exceptions, qualifications to the arguments that he makes. But there are times when Smith does speak unequivocally. These statements are so to speak, hiding in plain sight. And I'm going to read a little bit from The Wealth of Nations in a moment. His statements on the power of commerce to transform society in a positive way, I believe, fall into this category. And let me just give you one example. This is kind of a long passage from Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, so I'm not going to read it all. This is from the section where he's dealing with the problem of religion. In the state in which things were through the greater part of Europe during the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and for some time both before and after that period, the constitution of the Church of Rome may be considered the most formidable combination that ever was formed against the authority and security of civil government, as well as against liberty and the happiness of mankind, which can flourish only where civil government is able to protect them. In that constitution, the grossest delusions of superstition were supported in such a manner by the private interests of so great a number of people as put them out of all danger from any assault of human reason. Because though reason might perhaps have been able to unveil, even to the eyes of the common people, some of the delusions of superstition, it could never have dissolved the ties of private interest. Had this constitution been attacked by no other enemies, but the feeble efforts of human reason, it must have endured forever. But that immense and well-built fabric, it must have, which all wisdom and virtue of man could never have shaken, much less overturned, was by the natural course of things, by commerce, and is now likely, in part destroyed, and is now likely, in the course of a few centuries, more perhaps, to crumble into ruins altogether. Smith's comments reflect his discovery and exploration of a power that already exists in the world, but had largely gone unnoticed, except by Montesquieu and Voltaire. Smith leaves those guys out. Namely the power of commerce. The power is stronger and more reliable than human reason. Furthermore, it effectively promotes and advances human reason and human liberty. This is a remarkable and indeed radical claim, and I believe qualifies Smith to be dubbed a radical Scot. There are other statements in The Wealth of Nations to do with the spreading of human liberty through commerce, and also the balance of power between civilized societies and barbarian societies. We could talk about those, because I think those also fall into this category of radical statements hiding in plain sight. But in the interest of time, I think I'll stop there and hand things over to Tom Merrill.